The heat that afternoon lay over the valley like a hand pressed flat against the mouth of a stove, and every soul in the town of Cranmore Reach had crowded into the shade of the old grain platform to hear what the quiet woman with the calloused hands would say. There were near 200 of them, more than had ever gathered for anything but a burial. And they were quiet, the way people go quiet when the thing they need most is held in the palm of someone they once laughed at. Alma Ruddick? She wrote her name, though the town had called her plenty else. Stood on the lowest board, with her hat in her hand, and looked at them without hurry. Behind her, past the split rail and the brush she had tamed, the whole slope of her 52 acres lay green and orderly, where 3 years back it had been a smother of thorn and rot. Somewhere in that green, there was a thing every dry-throated farmer in the county now wanted, and they had come to buy it, or to beg for it, and the man in the pale linen suit at the front had come to take it. She turned the hat once in her fingers. She let the silence stretch until it hummed. And what she decided in the next few minutes would settle the fate of 100 families through a summer that had already killed the Wells. But the truth was that the verdict had been passed long before, out on that ruined hillside, by the land itself, and by a herd of animals nobody else had wanted, and by an old man who told her once that the ground keeps an account no bank ever sees. To understand what she said that day, you have to go back 3 years. To the spring she came to Cranmore Reach with everything she owned in a canvas trunk and $41 folded in the toe of her boot. She had come from nowhere, anyone could name, a widow of 34 who did not care to explain herself, and the county had a parcel it could not give away. 52 acres on the north shoulder of Henslow Ridge, taxes 3 years in arrears, sold at the courthouse steps to whoever would cover the debt. The debt was $219. Alma stood at the back of the little crowd of buyers, most of them there for the good bottom land going in another lot. And when the clerk read out the Hensler parcel, a laugh went round like a passed bottle. The land was worthless, and everyone knew why. 40 years before, a man had planted grape stock on that slope, meaning to make wine, and he had died, and the vines had gone feral, and the wild grape, and the greenbrier, and the poison thorn had crawled out from the failed vineyard, and swallowed the whole hillside, so thick a grown man could not walk 10 feet into it. You could not cut it fast enough. You cut it, and it came back doubled. It had beaten 3 owners and the county both. The clerk asked twice for a bid, and got nothing but grinning. And then Alma raised her hand and said, in a voice that carried further than she meant it to, 219. The laughter changed then, curdled into something meaner and more amused all at once, and a big red-faced man named Pearl Hocking, who ran the largest sheep operation in the valley and liked the sound of his own certainty, called out, "Lady, you just paid $200 for a briar patch that'll eat you alive." And Alma, gathering the deed, the clerk slid across the table, answered only, "We'll see what it eats." That was the first anyone heard her make a promise, and they took it for a fool's bravado, and they went home and told it at their suppers as the best joke of the season. She spent 11 of her remaining dollars that same week on the second thing the town found funny. Down at the stock pens behind the feed store, there was a lot of animals nobody had bid on, either a scrub band of goats, 31 head, unregistered, hard-coated, wild-eyed things that a defaulting dairyman had abandoned when he could not sell their milk. Goats had no standing in Cranmore Reach. It was sheep country and cattle country, and a goat was what a poor man kept when he could not afford a proper animal, a browsing nuisance that jumped fences and stripped orchards. The feed store man was near ready to shoot the lot to save on hay. Alma looked at them a long while through the rails. There was one old buck among them, gray-muzzled, enormous, with horns that swept back like the bows of a boat, and he stood in the churn of the others with a stillness that was almost lordly, watching her watch him. She named him in her head before she named the rest. She paid the $11, and she borrowed a neighbor's stock wagon on the promise of a day's labor, and she drove her 31 goats up the wagon track to the ruined green slope of Henslow Ridge, while men leaned on the store porch and shook their heads at the pure waste of it. A woman alone, they said, with a fool's patch of thorn and a wagon of jumping vermin, and not the sense between them to feed a hen through winter. The house on the parcel was half a house, 2 rooms with a sound roof over one of them, and the sky over the other, and a stone chimney, the color of old bread. The first night she slept on the floor of the dry room, with the goats penned in the yard by a fence she had strung of whatever wire she could scavenge, and she lay listening to them shift and mutter in the dark, and did the arithmetic that would rule the next 3 years of her life. $41 had become 19. $19. 31 goats. 52 acres she could not walk across. She could buy flour and lamp oil and nails. And after that there was nothing between her and hunger but whatever the land would give, and the land gave nothing but thorns. She had bought, everyone agreed, a debt with a fence around it. In the morning she stood at the edge of the green wall of vine that came right up to her dooryard, a wall higher than her head, dense as a hedge grown mad, and she took a billhook to it, and swung until her palm split, and by noon she had opened a gap the size of a doorway. And by the time the light went, she looked back, and the gap had already begun to close with the day's new growth, reaching for the sun. She sat down on the chimney stone and put her face in her ruined hands. She had made, she understood, a mistake she could not undo, and she was going to lose everything to a hillside that had beaten better than her, and the arithmetic came out to nothing, no matter which way she turned it. It was the old buck that turned her. Somewhere in the failing light, she heard a commotion at the fence and got up, expecting a broken wire and a scattered herd, and instead she found the whole band pressed against the rails on the vineyard side, and the old gray buck up on his hind legs, with his forelegs hooked over the top wire, reaching, straining, his long tongue wrapped around a trailing runner of the wild grape, pulling it into his mouth and grinding it down with a look of pure animal joy. Behind him, the others crowded and bawled to get at the same thing. They did not want her scavenged hay. They wanted the wall. They wanted the very thing that had beaten every man who came before her. And they wanted it the way a starving man wants bread. Alma stood in the dusk and watched 31 goats yearning toward the exact poison she had been slashing at all day with a billhook. And something moved in her that was not quite hope and not quite arithmetic, but the first cousin of both. She did not sleep much that night either, but it was a different not sleeping. She opened the fence to them at first light, a narrow throat of it against the green wall, and she watched what they did, because watching, she was beginning to understand, might be the only tool she had that the land could not blunt. And what they did was eat, not graze the way a sheep grazes, head down, cropping grass. They rose up and stripped the vine from the top. They peeled bark. They took the leaves and the tender runners and the very growing tips where the plant kept its ambition, and they moved through the tangle where no man could walk, threading the thorn on their nimble, hard feet, going up into it the way water goes down into a crack. By evening they had cleared a bite out of the green wall, bigger than everything she had managed in a day of bleeding labor, and the difference was they had eaten the part that grew back. She learned that first week to move them, to pen them tight on a small patch so they ate it to the ground and trampled the rest, and then to shift the pen and let the eaten ground rest. And she strung her poor wire in new lines each morning and each evening, and the thing that had beaten 3 men in a county began, an acre at a time. So slow, no one in town would have believed it to give. It was in that first month, with her hand still splitting and healing and splitting again, that the old man came up her track. He came on foot, leaning on a peeled staff, an immigrant everyone in the valley knew and half feared. Old Emmerich Vance, who had come over from the mountains of somewhere before the war and kept bees and a walnut grove, and spoke little and missed nothing. The town said he was strange, because he would stand in a field an hour, doing nothing that they could see. He walked into her cleared patch and looked at the goats working the wall, and looked at the ground where they had already been, where the sun was reaching soil that had not felt it in 40 years, and he stood a long time in his fashion, and then he said in his soft accent that put the weight on the wrong words, "Good." The others fought it. "You cannot win a fight with a hillside. You can only make an agreement." Alma asked him what agreement she had made. The old man tapped his staff on the bared ground. "The vine wants to live and grow. The goat wants to eat and live. You wanted the hill. 3 wants. You put them so each one feeds the next, and now the hill does your work for its own reasons." He looked at her a while. "Land is not a debt, though your neighbors think so. Land is a ledger, and it keeps its own accounts, and it settles slow. What the farmer forgets, the ground remembers. But it only ever whispers the balance, so you must be quiet enough to hear." Then he told her the thing that changed everything, the practical thing under the parable. He told her that goat's milk from brows like hers, from wild grape and cedar and herb, made a cheese in the old country that no grass-fed animal could match, sharp and complex and dear, and that she was standing on a fortune and calling it a briar patch. He came back 3 days later with a copper kettle and a cloth-wrapped culture from his own cellar, and showed her hands that had made cheese for 60 years how it was done, and he would take no pay but a promise she would learn it right. She learned it right. Through that whole first summer, while the town forgot her, Alma cleared the ridge a penwith at a time, and milked her does morning and night, and made cheese in the cool of the hap-house, and she failed at it 100 ways before she made a wheel that did not crumble or sour, and old Vance tasted each failure and told her plainly what was wrong. By the time the leaves turned, she had a shelf of small, hard wheels aging in the stone cool room, and the goats had eaten 11 of her 52 acres clean down to grass she had not known was under there, buried seed that had waited 40 years in the dark, and now came up green where the sun reached it. And she had gained, without quite noticing, a second helper. He was a boy of about 10, named Toby Sear, from the poorest family on the Ridge Road, a silent, watchful child whose father drank what little the family made and whose mother took in wash. Toby had started by watching from the fence line and had ended by being there every day, moving the wire, holding the daws at milking, and, above all, naming the goats, for he could not abide a nameless animal. He named the old gray buck Admiral, for the way he stood, and he named the does after the weather, thunder and drizzle and fair weather, and a small quick one called Squall. And he never once laughed at Alma, and in the whole valley he may have been the only living person besides Vance who looked at what she was doing and saw sense instead of folly. He would sit on the chimney stone and eat a heel of her bread and say things like, "Admiral don't eat the cedar till he's had the grape first. He's particular." And she would say, "He is," and they would watch the herd work the wall in a companionship that asked for nothing. The town, when it noticed her at all, noticed only to be reminded of the joke. She walked the 4 miles to Cranmore Reach once a fortnight for flour and salt, and Pearl Hocking or one of his kind would call out from the store porch, "How's the briar patch, Miss Ruddock?" Berman cleared it yet, and she would answer, "Coming along," and they would laugh, because coming along was what a fool always said. She did not tell them about the grass under the thorns, or the wheels aging in the stone room, or the milk that came sweeter than any dairyman's in the county. She banked it. She kept it low and quiet the way you keep a coal buried under ash through a cold night, giving off no light, wasting no heat, waiting for the morning when you would need a fire. Vance had told her that too, that a thing kept quiet keeps its strength, that the loud harvest is the one the frost finds first. So she was quiet, and the valley pitied her when it thought of her at all, and the pity suited her fine, because pity asks no questions and makes no offers. But one offer did come, that first autumn, and it told her something she filed away. A man drove up her track in a fine trap behind a matched pair. A smooth, well-fed man in a pale linen suit, with a soft voice and a way of smiling that never reached above his mouth. He gave his name as Denton Fallow, and said he represented the Ridgeline Land and Water Consortium, a group of gentlemen who were quietly acquiring parcels along the whole run of Henslow Ridge with an eye to the future. He walked her cleared ground with his hands behind his back and his eyes going over everything, and he said what a shame it was, a woman alone taking on such punishing land, and how his consortium would be glad to relieve her of the burden. He offered her $300 for the 52 acres and the improvements. It was more than she had paid, and he made it sound like charity, like a rescue, and he watched her face for the gratitude. Alma looked out at Admiral standing lordly in the sun, on ground that had been thorn wall in the spring, and she said, "It's not for sale." Fallow's smile stayed put, but his eyes cooled. "Everything's for sale, Miss Ruddock, at the right hour. I'll wait for yours." And he drove away, and she stood a long time wondering why a consortium of gentlemen would want a worthless Briar Hill badly enough to send a man in linen up a wagon track, and what it was they knew about Henslow Ridge that the laughing town did not. She learned part of it the next spring, though not from Fallow. The clearing had reached the 40th acre by then, the herd grown to 61 head with the season's kids, and Toby now near 12 and grown into a right hand, and old Vance coming up twice a week to taste the cheese and nod. The wheels in the stone room had aged into something the old man pronounced the equal of anything his grandfather made. Sharp and grassy and deep, and Alma had begun to wrap them in cloth and sell them, first to Vance's own countrymen scattered in the hills, then further. And that spring the outside validator came, the way such men always come, from beyond the valley where the local joke had no jurisdiction. He was a buyer for a hotel in the far city, a round particular man named Castle, who drove the back roads tasting what the hills produced, and he had heard from a drover of a strange cheese made by a woman on a ruined ridge. He tasted one wheel standing in her dooryard and went still, and tasted a second, and asked her what she wanted for the whole shelf. She named a price she thought outrageous, $1.25 the wheel, and he laughed with delight and said he would take every wheel she could make at twice that and pay a wagon to fetch them monthly, for there was nothing like it to be had at any price in the city, and the rich would pay what the rich pay for rare things. He drove off with 40 wheels, and left her with more money in her apron than she had held since the day she came, and Toby danced in the dooryard, and Alma sat on the chimney stone and did the arithmetic again, and found for the first time that it came out to a future. That summer the second wave broke over her. Fallow came again, and this time the softness had a floor under it. He raised his offer to $800 and let slip in his smooth way that the consortium was buying up the whole ridge because a survey of theirs had found that the underground water of the region gathered and ran along a seam beneath Henslow, and whoever held the ridge would hold the water in a dry year, and dry years, he said, always come. He said it as though it were a kindness to warn her, a woman alone who could not hope to develop such an asset herself. He said the consortium would sink wells and sell water to the whole valley and grow fat, and she could be part of it, or she could be swept aside. Alma listened and said only that it was not for sale, and Fallow's mouth smiled and his eyes did not. And he said, "You'll wish you'd taken the 800, Miss Ruddock, when the wells go dry and yours goes with them." She did not tell him what she had not yet told anyone, what she had found the previous month when the herd, clearing the last deep hollow on the north face where the thorn had grown thickest of all, had bared to the light a thing 40 years lost. She had gone into the cleared hollow to see why the goats gathered there and lingered, and she had found under a curtain of dead vine an old stone box built into the ground, mortared field stone with a stone lid half slid off, and inside it, cold and clear and rising, was water. It was a spring box, built by the vineyard man himself all those years ago, to catch and hold a spring that fed his stock, and the thorn had grown over it and hidden it so completely that not even the county maps remembered it. The spring had never stopped. It had run all those years under the briar, into the ground. Patient as the land is patient, and now it lay open again in her cleared hollow, cold and steady, brimming a stone box, and running off in a rill down the slope. She had knelt by it a long time. She understood then part of what Fallow's consortium was hunting, up and down the ridge, with their surveys and their offers. They were looking for the water. And it was on her land, in the open, and they did not know it. And she banked that too. Deepest of all, the coal beneath all the other coals. The dry year Fallow had promised came in the third summer, and it came the way he said it would, like the open door of a furnace swung wide and left standing. The spring rains failed. The creeks that fed the valley shrank to strings of warm puddles, and then to cracked mud. The wells that the town had trusted for 2 generations dropped, and the shallow ones went first, and then the deep ones began to fail, one by one, sucking air and grit. Pearl Hawking's grand flock, 2,000 head that grazed the fat bottomland, began to die, because grass without water is dust, and a sheep cannot eat dust, and the bottomland browned and cracked, and the great operations that had laughed at the goat woman watched their wealth turn to bone in the pastures. But up on Henslow Ridge, Alma's herd did not suffer as the valley suffered. Goats want browse, not lawn, and the deep-rooted brush and the cedar and even the stubborn drought-proof grape she had left in strips along the boundaries stayed green far into the burning when the grass was long gone. And a goat needs less water than a sheep or a cow, and finds moisture in the leaves it eats. And her animals drank from a stone box, fed by a spring that ran cold and steady out of a seam the drought could not reach. The same seam Fallow's consortium had bought half a ridge trying to find. While the valley died of thirst, the water came up out of Alma Ruddock's cleared hollow, as it had come up all along, patient, remembered, waiting. Word of it got out, as water always does. First it was a neighbor whose well had failed, come up the track in shame with 2 empty pails, unable to meet her eye. A man who had laughed on the store porch, asking could he take a little water for his children, and he had nothing to pay. Alma filled his pails and told him to bring what pails he had and pay her nothing, and she watched him go down the track and understood that the hour Fallow had promised her had come, only it was not the hour he meant. Or, then it was 2 families, then a dozen, a slow procession of pails and barrels and stunned faces up the wagon track. To the woman they had marked, and she turned none of them away and took none of their money, only asked of those who were able, that they help clear the last acres of thorn or mend her fence, or turn a hand at the cheese, so that it was labor she took and never coin for the water itself, and the ridge that had been so lonely was busy now with people who had never come near it. And Fallow came too, the third and hardest wave, when he understood what she had, and there was no softness left in him at all. He came to her dooryard in the worst week of the drought, and he did not offer to buy any more. He told her, in a voice gone flat and cold, as the bottom of the spring box, that the consortium held the water rights to the whole run of Henslow Ridge, that they had bought them from the county along with the parcels, and that her spring, wherever it rose, fed a seam that ran under land they owned, and that therefore the water was legally theirs, and she was stealing it and giving it away, and they would have the law on her. He said the consortium meant to control every drop in the valley and sell it dear, as was their right, and that a dry town would pay anything and grow the consortium fat, and that she had better sign over her parcel and her spring before the sheriff came, for she was one woman alone and could not fight a chartered company with lawyers in the city. He was so sure of himself, so smooth in his ruin of her, that he made a mistake men like him always make in the end. To prove the reach of his knowing, to frighten her with how much he saw, he said, "We know your spring puts out better than 400 gallons the hour, Miss Ruddock. We know it never dropped a cupful through the whole drought. You cannot hide a thing like that from us." And Alma went very still, because she had told no one that figure, had measured it herself, alone in the gray of a morning, with a bucket and Vance's old watch, 410 gallons the hour, and had spoken it to not a living soul. And the only way a man in linen could know it to the cup was if he had been up on her ridge in the dark, with a bucket of his own, spying, trespassing, measuring what he meant to steal. She said nothing to him then. She let him finish his threats and drive away, and she went and found old Vance and told him the figure Fallow had let slip, and the old man smiled the way he rarely did, and said, "He has told you how he will hang himself. Now you have only to hand him the rope in front of everyone." And they made a plan. The goat woman and a beekeeper, in the cool of the stone room, over a wheel of cheese, while the valley burned, which brings the account back to the grain platform in the flat white heat of that afternoon. And the near 200 souls crowded into its shade, and Alma Ruddock standing on the lowest board with her hat in her hand. Fallow had called the gathering himself. He had come into town in his trap with 2 lawyers and a sheaf of papers, and he had stood up on the platform first, and told the desperate valley that the Ridgeline Consortium held the rights to all the water on Henslow Ridge, including the spring that the Ruddock woman had been giving away against the law, and that from this day the consortium would take control of that water and distribute it fairly, for a fair price, so much the barrel, and that a signed order from the county backed him, and he waved his papers. And a groan went up from the town because they had no money in a dead year, and they saw the smooth man in linen turning their thirst into his fortune, and they saw the goat woman standing there small and quiet beside him, and they did not yet know whose side the day was on. Fallow smiled his smile that never reached his eyes, and asked Alma, for the form of it, before witnesses, whether she would sign over her parcel and cease her unlawful distribution. And he was so certain she would crumble that he had already turned to his lawyers. Well, Alma turned the hat once in her fingers. She let the silence stretch until it hummed. Then she spoke, not loud, but the way she had learned to speak. So a still crowd leaned in. She said, "Mr. Fallow says he holds the water. I'd like the town to hear how well he knows it, Mr. Fallow. Tell these people how much my spring puts out." And Fallow, still certain, still showing off the reach of his consortium, said, 410 gallons the hour, steady through the whole drought, as our records show. And Alma looked out at the 200 faces and said, quiet and clear, "I measured that figure alone, in the dark one morning, with a bucket and a borrowed watch. I never wrote it down. I never told a soul. There is only one way, mister. Fallow knows it to the very cup, and that is that he or his men were up on my land in the dark, trespassing, spying, measuring the spring they mean to steal. He has just confessed it in front of all of you." The silence broke like a dropped plate. Fallow's smile came apart. He started to bluster about surveys and estimates, but the number was too exact, the cup too fine, and the town had heard it from his own mouth. And old Vance stood up in the crowd and said in his soft carrying accent, 410. He said the 10. A survey does not know the 10. Only a thief in the dark knows the 10. And a low sound went through the crowd, not a cheer, worse than a cheer, the sound of 200 people deciding all at once that a man is a liar and a sneak. Then Alma raised her hand, and the crowd hushed for her and not for him. And she said the thing that settled it. She said, "The spring is on my land. I found it under 40 years of thorn that no man in this valley would touch. It never was the county's to sell to any consortium, because the county forgot it was there, and you cannot sell what you have forgotten you own. Any lawyer of mine will tell you a right cannot be granted twice, and the county granted me that parcel, and everything under it 3 years ago, at the courthouse for $219, before Mr. Rhea. Fallow's gentlemen ever drew their map. She let that land. So the water is mine to do with as I please. And here is what pleases me." She looked out over the sunburned, desperate faces of the people who had laughed at her for 3 years. "I will not sell it to Mr. Fallow for any price, because a man who would starve a valley for a fortune has no business owning water. And I will not sell it to you either. Water is not a thing I made. I only cleared the thorn off it. So it is yours, all of you, free, for as long as this drought runs and after. Bring your pails and your barrels. All I ask from those with the strength is a day's labor now and again on the ridge. For a spring wants tending, and a fence wants mending, and a woman alone cannot do it all. Pay me in work if you like. But the water you pay for with nothing, because it was never mine to charge you for. For a moment, no one moved. Then Pearl Hucking, the big red-faced man who had started the laughing 3 years before, who had lost near his whole flock to the drought and stood ruined among them, took off his hat. He held it against his chest, and he said loud, so all could hear in a voice that shook, I called you a fool, Miss Ruddock. I called you worse. I was the fool. And he turned to the crowd and put himself between them, and Follow, and said, I'll take the first day's labor on the ridge. Who's with me? And the hats came off all across the shade of the grain platform, one, and then a dozen, and then all of them. Men who had mocked her, standing bareheaded in the heat, and the tide of the whole valley turned in the space of a breath, the way it does after long restraint, all at once and total. Follow gathered his papers with shaking hands and got no one to meet his eye, and his lawyers looked at the crowd and looked at each other and put their pens away, and the smooth man in linen walked out through a silence that was worse to him than any shouting. Defeated not by law or by force but by a number, he could not resist saying out loud, undone by his own greed, the way such men always are. The rains came 3 weeks later, a slow, gray, steady soak out of the west that ran 2 days, and the valley drank, and the creeks filled, and the wells came back one by one, and the burned bottomland went green at the roots. The spring in Alma's stone box ran on exactly as it always had, 410 gallons the hour, needing no rain, keeping its own account. She was no longer the joke of the county, or the woman alone in the mocking sense they had meant it. She was Alma Ruddock of Hensler Ridge, whose goats had cleared what no man could clear, whose cheese the city rich paid a fortune for, whose spring had carried the whole valley through the burning summer. The wagon from the city still came monthly for the wheels, more of them now, for Toby was near 14 and a full hand, and there was a second boy learning the milking, and the herd was above 90 head, and Admiral grayer than ever, and lordly as ever in his old age. The valley folk came up on their days to mend the fence and clear the last strips of thorn, and sit a while in the dooryard, and it was a strange thing to see the porch of that half-house, now a whole house with a new roof over both rooms, crowded of an evening with the very people who had leaned on the store porch and laughed. Old Vance came up the track, one soft evening near the end of that season, leaning on his peeled staff, slower now, and he stood a long while in his fashion, looking out over the cleared green slope where the goats worked the last of the wall in the low gold light, and at the stone spring box brimming cold in its hollow, and at the wheels of cheese aging in the stone room, and at the woman who had come with $41 and a fool's patch of thorn. He said in his soft accent that put the weight on the wrong words, I told you the land keeps a ledger and settles slow 3 years, but look how it has paid you. Alma sat on the chimney stone with a new kid asleep in her lap. A small, quick doe Toby had already named Sunrise, and she looked out at the balance the land had rendered, the green where the thorn had been, the water where the drought had been, the friends where the mockers had been. She said, it paid the whole valley. And the old man nodded and tapped his staff on the good bare ground and said, that is why it paid you most of all the ground remembers who is quiet enough to hear it, and you were quiet. Down the slope the old buck admiral lifted his great gray head and looked back at the two of them on the chimney stone, still and lordly in the last of the light, and then bent again to his eating, and the spring ran on cold and steady in its stone box, keeping the account it had kept for 40 years under the thorn and would keep for 40 more. Patient as the land is patient, whispering its balance to anyone quiet enough to listen.
Café, mais Jenny n'a pas trouvé mieux avec je crois que c'était avec Sadalar, il me semble, heu, sur TikTok, de se foutre de moi et et oui, j'ai sauvé mon pull rose. Donc ils se sont moqués de moi et Jenny a dit: «Moi, je dis que ça vaut un bavoir, en fait. Il faut qu'on lui offre un bavoir. Voilà, mamie, elle a besoin d'un bavoir, tout ça» et puis c'en est resté là et puis quelque p temps après, elle m'a renvoyé un message, elle m'a dit: «Je ne t'oublie pas, je t'enverrai ton bavoir». Puis c'en est resté là et puis quelque temps après, elle m'a dit: «J'ai un colis qui est prêt pour toi». À savoir que, si je me trompe pas et tu me dis si je me trompe, Jenny, elle l'a fait faire par sa maman. Voilà, donc je vais vous montrer le petit cadeau que j'ai eu, le petit colis que j'ai eu. J'ai et oui, oui, papy, j'étais bien habillée pour une fois, mais ça a pas duré, tu vois? Donc je vous montre officiellement